It's the year of inviting. Today, invite someone into your story. Thanks for joining me. I'm Jeff Gertson. Our reading today comes from Hebrews 11. I read from verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. This is God's word to us today. Mrs. Moore was my grade 4 teacher. To my 10-year-old eyes, Mrs. Moore was ancient. I don't remember a thing that she taught me, but I do remember that Mrs. Moore was brilliant at telling stories. We'd all work as fast as our little brains and our hands could muster during lesson time in order to finish early, so that there'd be time for Mrs. Moore to tell us more of her story. Each day the characters would unfold and the adventures would continue. There were stories of knights and heroes, of dragons slayed and victories won. There were stories of princesses and happily ever afters, of sunsets and sunrises, of loss and triumph. As I reflect back on Mrs. Moore's stories, I suspect that she made them all up on the spot. On and on she would weave the magic that kept our little hearts enchanted. Today, may I talk to you about stories? Your life is comprised of 3 stories. Let's explore the story that we're living, the story that we're listening to, and the story that we're telling. And then I want, in this year of inviting, to challenge you to invite someone into your story. Firstly, the story that we're living. It began when you were born, wherever you were born. Your story is played out in a city called Cape Town, or wherever else, in the year 2022. Each of us has parents and perhaps a spouse and children that are a major part of the story. Not always, sadly, a good part of the story. Your parents may have been dysfunctional or absent. They may be angry or spiteful, or they may be kind. We have siblings and friends and associates. We have a church and we have a life group. Our story includes a job if we're lucky enough. If we're very lucky, it's work that we enjoy, work in which we feel appreciated. We wake up each day, we dress for work, sometimes we sing, but on other occasions there's a sigh and a groan as the sun rises. Our story involves breakfast, a wash or a shave, some trips to the toilet. We clean our teeth. We make the bed. Then we commute, perhaps to an office or down the passage to a Zoom call in the study. Perhaps that commute is the dreaded school run. Angry parents all rushing, trying to get through the same space at the same time. We live in a home or a space to which we can retreat. Each of us lives a story. Our story is unavoidably interconnected with apartheid and race. We are born chocolate or pink or somewhere in between in a world where that silly distinction is considered important. We speak English or Xhosa or Afrikaans or perhaps Polish or Swedish. Our story is unavoidably influenced by money. Either we have it or we wish we did. Sex plays a part of our story, as do our parents' decisions. They chose our school. They chose to read to us, or they chose not to read to us. They were absent, or they were present. They brought us to church. They threw us a ball. We have dogs. We have cats. We're all living a story. Now, most people never consider the story that they're living very much. They just live. They attempt to squeeze every morsel of life out of every breath. They don't look too far ahead, and they don't look too far back. They just live each day as it comes. But along their story, pain happens. It just comes. Sometimes sooner, other times later, but come it will. Frustration mounts, jobs are boring and unfulfilling or hard to find. Companies go bankrupt, people are retrenched. We get sad for good reasons and sometimes for no reason at all. And we get hurt. We desire and we lust, and somehow in the story of our lives we manage to hurt other people too. And then death comes to those we love, and our hearts start to wonder if there might just be something more. The book of Hebrews, which is a Bible book about persevering as a Christian, holds up to us the example of people's stories. Hebrews 11 speaks of the heroes of faith when it says in chapter 11 verse 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. The Bible importantly teaches us that their stories were incomplete when they died. These are the heroes of the faith. Abraham, Moses, Gideon, David, others, their lives weren't happily ever after. In fact, the Bible teaches us that the story we're now living is the prequel, the foreword, the introduction, the first chapter of a much bigger story. And the much bigger story can have a happy ending, even as our present story often seems to be a tragedy. Now, just imagine messing up the introduction to the biggest story. Imagine living a story now that meant the biggest story was an ultimate failure. Cecil John Rhodes and his legacy are very much in the story of Cape Town and our country. His memorial broods over the city from its mountain perch. It looks over the land that he once owned and that he desired for the empire. When Rhodes died, he was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world. He was, I suppose, the Elon Musk or the Jeff Bezos or the Bill Gates of his day. He was the envy of everyone. But today his statue has gone from UCT. His legacy is being progressively erased. He was a benefactor of Oriel College in Oxford, leaving them an enormous sum of money. And his statue stands overlooking the college. But his story contains the dark legacy of racial and colonial oppression. It's a story of land seizures and forced removals. It's a story of colonialism and violence. It's a story that has taken some time to unfold. A great debate rages over what to do with his statue at Oriel College. One recent suggestion is that it should be turned to face inwards, in disgrace, because his story is a story that should not be celebrated. In contrast, there are many stories that won't be told. Stories of hidden heroes, of mothers sacrificing their lives and their dreams for their children. Stories of men and women praying in the dark nights. Stories of heroes starting works of service to aid vulnerable people that will never be told. Stories that will never go viral, of lives that hold eternal value. My opening declaration to us today is simply to remind us that we are living a story. Now, secondly, I want you to notice that the story you're living is shaped by the story that you are listening to. When a baby is born, joy rings out. Slowly, babies learn their names and the sounds around them from the voices they hear. They learn the sound of their parents' voices. They turn their heads when their mothers speak, and they smile. And in the early years, they want no other voices in their lives. They scowl at strangers and they turn their heads away. In time, children learn to speak. They speak what they've heard. No child ever spontaneously learnt Russian or Spanish. They speak what they hear all around them every day. As their parents speak to them, after months of listening, they say just one word. It's not even said correctly in the beginning, but it is beautiful to their parents. Dada, mama, star. Then more words come. Amongst them, some come from deep within their hearts. Mine, no. And soon, having learned to speak, the child embarks on a far more important journey. It's the journey that will take them the rest of their lives to learn. We learn to listen. And the voices we hear and the voices we listen to unavoidably shape the story that we live. Back to Hebrews 11 verse 13. It says this. It says, they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. Hearers of the faith. Well, they listened to another voice. It's the voice of God that told them the story of God. They heard that there's another day and another world. They listened to a story that told them that they were foreigners and strangers who were passing through. They saw another world without seeing it because they heard the promises of it and they welcomed it and they lived for it and they put their hearts there. The world they heard of is an eternal world different to this one. It's a world where God is present. The God who is big and the God who's kind. They did not receive that world in this world, but they listened to the stories of it. And their lives were different. All around us, we hear voices speaking, shouting, calling, some whispering. If you're black, the story that's often told is a story of your inferiority. And it will be hard not to listen to that narrative. If you're white or you're rich, the story that is told is that you're superior, you're of greater worth. There are voices to ignore because they lie. If you're a woman, the stories told are often that you're inadequate or inferior. Lies. All around you. Voices. You're the cream of the crop, destined to succeed, is the message told at the elite schools. You'll never succeed is the message heard in the townships. The South African cricket team hears the story again and again. You're chokers. You can't do it. Australian sports teams hear another message. You're the greatest. You're winners. Even when you're losing, you're winning. Hollywood has a story too. It's a story of free sex and unbounded freedom, told by actors and writers who live in bondage to their own addictions, who struggle with meaning and struggle with depression, and who, for the most part, can't even keep their own marriages together. And yet the world listens attentively to those stories. We eagerly consume the garbage that comes from the A-list personalities as if it is profoundly important. All around us are stories told that your body is not good enough, and that the only way you'll ever be happy is if you have much, much, much more. Around us, all sorts of stories are being trumpeted. And your story is determined by which stories you are listening to. If you're a white South African, the story you'll hear every day in the media is that the country's gone to the dogs, and the sooner you can get your money into Bitcoin or dollars and get your papers to somewhere else, the better. But if you take yourself off to Kenilworth Centre down the road and you listen to the car guards from the DRC, you will hear another story. It's a story of a country that's offering them hope and a new life and a better future from the ashes of their past. So which stories are you listening to? If you listen to science and philosophy, you will hear a story about yourself. Postmodern philosophy says there is no big story, no meta-narrative. Science agrees. It says that the story is a story of an impersonal Big Bang, which means that you're an accident, a cosmic happenstance of time and energy. There is no ultimate to this life, only the search for maximum happiness in the few hours that we have left. If you listen to economics, it will tell you that life is about maximum possessions. But God whispers to us another story. He tells us that He is there, and that He is big, and that He is kind. He tells us that we are deeply flawed, but that we are also deeply loved. He tells us that humans are made in His image. We were made perfect to reflect His glory, but somehow we turned away. We became rebels. We chose to listen to another story. A story without God at the center. A story with us at the center. And all of the chaos that we see around us and all the pain that we endure is the consequence of that choice, that listening. We are deeply flawed. More flawed than we will ever realize. So flawed are we that we cannot even see the depth of our flaws. We judge and condemn people on things that we do ourselves. Our hearts are not free. They're skewed. Fundamentally turned away from the very God that made us. But there is a parallel story. Another story alongside that one. It is the story of God, a story of eternity. It's a story of his enduring commitment, a story of his steadfast love, a story of his holiness and his justice. It's a story of reckless love, costly, sacrificial, pain-filled kind of love. It's a story of promises made. God whispers that he can and will fix it all. He shadows what he will do through centuries of action so that we don't miss the climax that happens when the time is right. At a moment in history, he acts. He does what only God can do. He embraces our very-ness, and he comes as a man born in a cattle shed. We tried everything we could to stop him. We even killed his son. We crucified God. What offense could be greater? But our deep rebellion does not change his deep love for us. And in fact, it is in that very act of our ultimate defiance that God orchestrates an eternal solution of forgiveness. God fixes the mess. The story you listen to will determine the shape of the story that you live. If you hear enough times that you are valueless, then you will live a valueless life. If you listen to the story that money will give you joy, then you will pursue money with every fiber of your being. If you hear that you are deeply flawed, but deeply loved, if you hear that there is a God who is completing another story, then that will mold and shape the story that you're living. Which brings me to our final story. It's the story that we are telling with our lives. You see, there is a third story. It is the story that we tell. The story you tell will be heard from your lips. You will tell it on your social media posts, and you will tell it when you speak. The story you tell will be seen in your day-to-day choices. It will be seen when you smile or when you don't smile. The story you tell will be heard by your spouse when you wake up and when you return from work. And the story you tell will be heard in your heart by God. The story you tell will be heard in your prayers and visible in your actions. The story you tell will unavoidably shine outwards from the life you live. Here is Hebrews 11 again. Verse 14 says, people who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they'd left, they would have had opportunity to return. Verse 16, instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Christians in the West don't tell a story of another day. It's hard to tell a story of another day when you live in such prosperity and ease and comfort. We're a church sent on mission to the southern suburbs of Cape Town. So what is the story that we're telling? Do people gossip of us that we're a church telling a story of love? That we're a church of devotion, a church of commitment? Or do they gossip that we're not terribly different from them? What story does your life group leader think in their hearts about you? About you and your priorities and your values based on the life that you're living? Does your life group leader speak to their spouses of the joys that they experience of leading you because of the love that is shared in the group? Do they complain to the church staff that the members of their groups are just so committed that they just keep asking all these questions that they just can't answer? Or do they dread Wednesday late afternoon when the WhatsApps start to come? Sorry, can't be there tonight. Too tired. Too busy. Translated, that means I gave my all to my boss and my job, and I have no energy left for my soul or for you. What story are we telling to our domestic workers? Does she go home and tell her family about your generosity and your kindness and your gentleness? Or does she go home and tell her family that I will never be like them? What story are you telling with your tax return? As your financial advisor looks at our investments, does she notice that we are somehow fundamentally different to her non-Christian clients? Is our story the story of us living for another day, another country, another city? A city with God at its center, a city where Jesus is honored. You see, we live a story. We listen to a story. And our lives tell a story. When we listen to what God has done for us, it unavoidably changes us. God's indicative actions lead us to live. Love starts to leak out from us as we hear and remember that we are deeply loved. Kindness appears in the funniest moments, accompanied by gentleness, when before there might have been anger, because we keep hearing that God has been kind to us. We actually start to become patient. We start to deal with our anger and not spread it onto the undeserving. As we hear of God's 77 times 7 patience with us. When we know that we are forgiven and that there is another city, then forgiveness seems to appear in our hearts, followed by peace. Even when our lives are pain and heartache, when we look to another day, we can live with hope, not for a better South Africa, but for a celestial city, a country that is up ahead. We live, we listen, and we tell a story. What story are you living? What story are you listening to? And what story are you telling? I've been the minister of this church for 20 years. I count that as a staggering privilege because I've known people. I've really known people. I've seen children born and them grow up. I've watched people die. I've seen people abandon God. And I've seen people come back to God. I've really known people. As I was preparing this, I was seeing again many of their faces. They'll not be remembered when I'm finished here. But today, I remember their stories. Some living for another day. Living the first chapter of the rest of their lives. And they were just the most beautiful people to know. Here is my 4th challenge in the year of inviting. Consider the stories that you are living, listening to, and telling. And then invite someone into your story. Come, let's pray. Father, we'll not receive the things promised. We are strangers and aliens passing through. But we keep on putting down roots and we keep on building foundations. We seek another homeland. We desire a better country, a heavenly one. You're a big God and you are a kind God. You are our God who has told us of your story. You have promised it, died, risen, and you will return. May we hear, so listen, and then live that our lives sing of another day, another story, when we will be with you. Amen.